I want you to notice the progression of knowledge that our Father communicated to us. First, we began with just the daily cycle. Then we went to the weekly cycle of 7 days. Then the annual cycle or sabbatical cycle of 7 years. The Jubilee cycle is next on the list to be discussed. Remember, we spoke about the Pentecostal cycle as well. The Pentecostal cycle had 7 weeks of Sabbaths, ending with the day of Pentecost on the day after the 7th Sabbath. It was the 50th day. The Jubilee cycle is similar to the Pentecostal cycle in that there are 7 sabbatical cycles, and the year after the 7th sabbatical cycle is considered to be a year of Jubilee. So listen to what Leviticus 25 and verse 8 and 9 states. And thou shalt number 7 Sabbaths of years unto thee, 7 times 7 years, and the space of 7 Sabbaths of years shall be unto 49 years. Then shalt thou cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. In the day of atonement shall you make the trumpet sound throughout all your generations. So notice that the Jubilee cycle began at the end of the 7th sabbatical cycle, or the 7th sabbatical year, on the same month and day on which the 7th sabbatical cycle ends. There will be the beginning of the day of a year of Jubilee. Then shalt thou cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. In the day of atonement shall you make the trumpet sound throughout all your land. And this begins the year of Jubilee. Notice the 7 years. The first 7 years ends on a Sabbath year, and then there are 7 Sabbath years which end with the Jubilee year, which then becomes the 50th year. And ye shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land. Unto all the inhabitants thereof it shall be a Jubilee year, and you shall return every man unto his possession, and you shall return every man unto his family. A Jubilee shall that 50th year be unto you. You shall not sow, neither shall you reap. This was really a special year in the Jewish economy. I'm sure many people look forward to that year with great rejoicing, knowing that the debts they owed would be canceled, that families that they had not seen for a while will be returning. People will be receiving their possessions back. What they had lost before, they will receive it again. So this was a very special year in the life of the Jewish people. Now notice that the first great Jubilee cycle came after the 7th sabbatical year. And since we know when the first sabbatical year ended, then we can know when the 7th would end. And the first sabbatical year was 1444 BC. Therefore, the first Jubilee was calculated from that year, and it was 1401 BC. Each Jubilee cycle is 49 years. Notice the first great one, 1401 BC, was the first Jubilee cycle. Just as the Pentecostal cycle outlined certain special things that should be done, so we must understand that the Jubilee cycle was given for a purpose as well. The Jubilee is part of God's timetable. And here are unique timelines associated with the Jubilee cycle. From Abraham's time to the crossing of the Jordan in 1451 BC, there were 9 Jubilees. And from the crossing of the Jordan in 1451 BC to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, there were 31 Jubilees. Doing the math, you will discover that from Abraham to the destruction of Jerusalem were actually 40 Jubilees, or 1960 years. The 7th sabbatical cycle of the final 7 years of the Jewish final Jubilee cycle is indicated on the graph. Notice that the first year of that 7th sabbatical cycle was from 62 to 63 AD, and the second year was from 63 to 64, and the third from 64 to 65, and it continues with the 7th being 68 to 69. Now, the 7th was a Sabbath year. Notice, however, that the Jewish years for that same period was 3823, 3824, 3825, 3826, 3827, 3828, and then 3829, with 3030 being the Jubilee year that we also know as 70 AD. This is significant because I want you to see how that plays out as we look at the future. Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, and notice how things progressed that year, which was the year 3830, from 69 AD to 70 AD. And not to confuse you, I want you to identify the number of the Jewish year as 3830, but also remember that the Gregorian calendar year is 70 AD. In March of 70 AD, the Romans breached the third wall. In May 30th, the Romans entered the second quarter. July 22nd, the Antonia fortress falls to Titus. August 10th, the temple was destroyed by fire the exact same day and month on which it had been burnt by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. Then September 2nd, the Romans burnt the lower city, and by September 26th, the resistance ended and Herod's palace was destroyed. When that Jubilee year ended in September of that year, the destruction of Jerusalem was complete and completed. I want you to keep that in mind. Notice how the judgment of desolation was completed in the Jubilee year. During that year, Jerusalem was destroyed by Titus. Many people lost their lives. As many as 1.1 million Jews died and were burnt in the city when it was destroyed. 97,000 were taken captives out of Jerusalem. This was the most devastating thing that happened to Jerusalem since they were a nation, and that was prophesied by Daniel. In Daniel chapter 2, they experienced this time of trouble, such as was not since they were a nation, but many were delivered, whose names were written in the book even before the destruction came. The fact is that when Jerusalem was destroyed, all Daniel's prophecies had been fulfilled. Everything from the old ceremonial system was left desolate. Daniel 12 and verse 7, the second part, states, "When he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. Do we want it any plainer than that, friends? Daniel specified in the very last chapter of his book, the epilogue chapter, as he's signing off, when the question was asked, how long shall it be to the end of these wonders? He was told, times and a half, 3.5 years, and we already explained that that was the 3.5 years from the crucifixion to the end of the 77th prophecy. But the prophecy continued that when the destruction of Jerusalem takes place and the holy people were scattered, all these things were to be finished. That Jubilee year was 70 AD. But that year, I believe, was also a type. Just as Jerusalem was destroyed a second time on the same day and month as it was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, I believe that there is another symbolism attached to this destruction. Notice that Jubilee is part of God's timetable. There were 40 Jubilees from Abraham to the destruction of Jerusalem, but another 40 Jubilees right here from the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD to the end of this millennium and the next scheduled Jubilee, which is to be in 2030, is exactly 40 Jubilees. Notice that from Abraham again to the destruction of Jerusalem, there were 40 Jubilees, and from that Jubilee year of 70 AD to the next Jubilee year, we are now in the year 2013. The next Jubilee year is scheduled to be the year 2030, and that will be the 40th Jubilee since the destruction of Jerusalem. So type will meet antitype as well. The Jews' final Jubilee cycle is a type of the world's final Jubilee cycle leading up to the second coming of the Messiah and the destruction of the kingdom of this world. 40 Jubilees after 70 AD. The final Jubilee year is 2029 to 2030 AD. Any suggestions as what might happen in Earth's final Jubilee? That Jubilee year might also be transitional. Now, let's see if we can confirm the final Jubilee as the year 2030. God must have given some indication as to the end of the 6th millennium and the beginning of the 7th millennium. Here is where the 7th-day Sabbath, the 7th year Sabbath, the sabbatical cycle, the Jubilee cycle, and the 7th millennial cycle all converge. If the Jubilee of 70 AD spelled destruction for Jerusalem, could it be that the next Jubilee year and the last Jubilee before the 7th millennium will also spell destruction for what's coming upon the world? Let's look at the 7th sabbatical cycle of years, the world's final Jubilee cycle. Yes, it began in 1980 and it will continue until 2030. The 7 sabbatical cycles of years, the world's final Jubilee cycle. Notice the first sabbatical cycle ends in 1986-87. The second sabbatical cycle ended in 1993-94. The third sabbatical cycle ended in 2000 to 2001. The fourth sabbatical cycle ended in 2007-2008. 2012-2013 is in the fifth sabbatical cycle, leaving us with 2 sabbatical cycles after this sabbatical cycle ends in 2014-2015. Let's look at it from a different angle. Notice that the final Jubilee cycle of the 6th millennium is from 1981 to the year 2030. Notice also the Jewish years associated with this. 1980-81 was the year 5741. Notice that 5772 has already ended, and we are now in the year 2012-2013, which is the Jewish year 5773. Let's count how many years are left after this year, 5773. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. 16 years to the end of the 7th sabbatical cycle of this Jubilee. And then the next year will be the Jubilee year, and that will be the year 2029 to 2030. And, of course, we know that 2031 is the end of the 6th millennium, or let's just say the end of 2,000 years since Christ died on the cross. So, looking again at the 7th sabbatical cycle, or the final 7 years of the world's final Jubilee cycle, we have the Jews' calendar with the years 5783, 5784, 5785, 86, 87, 88, 89, and then 5790. 5790, the Jewish year, is from September 10th, 29 AD to September 28th, 30 AD. And that's the world's final Jubilee cycle. Now, if the Creator created this world in 6 days and rested on the 7th, in His plan of recreation or redemption, there is outlined another 6 days of work and one of rest. There's one difference, however. A day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, 2 Peter 3 and verse 8. So God's perfect number 7 outlines 6 millenniums of work and the 7th to rest. Here is a graphic illustration of that. 6 millenniums of work and the 7th millennium of rest. The great Sabbath millennium, if we choose to call it that, is therefore very, very soon. Notice another plan that was put in place to help us understand where we are in time. Notice, remember, this is all about time. And in every aspect, God's plan for us, He indicates certain time elements so we are not left in darkness. And in the sanctuary plan that was given, there's also embedded a time element for us. Notice Psalm 77 verse 13 says, Thy way is in the sanctuary. So if we study the sanctuary, there are some things that we will learn that will really surprise us. Notice that when Moses was told to build a sanctuary, build me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them, he was told. He was also advised that he should build the sanctuary according to a pattern that was shown to him while he was in the mount. And the floor plan for this pattern is illustrated here. The sanctuary, or the tabernacle, was to be 60 cubits in length. There was to be a room called the holy place of 40 cubits, and another room called the holiest was to be of 20 cubits. And a veil separated the holy from the most holy. There was a reason for that. The holy place represented what was to be the place where the animal sacrifices were offered. But notice that the priest could not go beyond that veil into the holiest. There's only one person that was qualified, and that was the high priest. And he had to purify himself, so when he entered into the holiest, it were as if he is entering as a sinless person, or he represented someone. Let's look a little closer to that. Even Josephus wrote, Now when the king had divided the temple into parts, He made the inner house, which was the most holy place, of 20 cubits to be the most secret chamber, but he appointed that of 40 cubits to be the sanctuary. Notice that Josephus calls the most holy place the inner house, which we refer to as the Holy of Holies. And the holy place was referred to by Josephus as the sanctuary. And again, the dimensions are listed. Now, if we were to make an application here, we would discover that the earthly sanctuary was constructed with 2 apartments in a 2-to-1 ratio, 40 cubits and 20 cubits. That typified the whole plan of redemption from Adam's sin to Christ's second coming. His first coming, however, was at a point represented by the veil that separated the 40 cubits holy place from the 20 cubits most holy place. And since the holy place was called a sanctuary, and the most holy place called the Holy of Holies, we discovered that if we separate the 2 apartments for emphasis, we discovered that no one but the high priest was allowed into the holy. And the Holy Ghost, this signifying, according to Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 8, the Holy Ghost, this signifying that a way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest, while the first tabernacle was yet standing. But when the cleansing of the sanctuary took place, Christ entered once into the sanctuary to cleanse it with his own blood. That is what we read most emphatically in Hebrews 9 and verse 12. He entered into the sanctuary to cleanse it with his own blood, and the sanctuary was represented by the 40 cubits, and then into the holiest, represented by the 20 cubits. He made reconciliation for iniquity when he died in 31 AD. He was also the high priest that applied the cleansing blood. And so, as the word says, the blood of Christ cleanses us from all sin. Now, when did that cleansing of sin begin? Of course, it began when Christ died on the cross for our sins. And that was the cleansing of the sanctuary. His blood cleansed our sins. So the 40 cubits represented 40 centuries or 4,000 years of animal sacrifices from Adam's sin to Christ's atonement in 31 AD. The sins that were symbolically cleansed by animal sacrifices since Adam were finally cleansed by the atonement and sanctuary cleansing in 31 AD. From Adam's sin to Christ's death on the cross was exactly 4,000 years. Following the atonement, he ascended to heaven. Thus, when Christ completed the atonement in 31 AD, he went through the veil into the heavenly Holy of Holies. Hebrews 10 verses 8 through 23 tells us that. And so the 20 cubit dimension of the most holy place represents 20 centuries or 2,000 years of Christ's ministry in the Holy of Holies in heaven itself, from his ascension to his second coming. This is very important, friend. Let's look again at this transition in the sanctuary, a view of 2 parts of the covenant. Christ's work moved from the holy place on earth to the holiest in heaven as our high priest with the Father. And so when he died, the veil of separation was removed. Christ's atonement on earth made it possible for us as well to enter boldly into the holiest by a new and living way he had consecrated for us, that is to say, his flesh. Hebrews 10 verses 18 through 22 will help us in an understanding of that as well. Where did Christ go? when he died and left the earth? Oh, there are so many sources that tell us. In John 14, verse 12 says, he said to his disciples, because I go to my Father. The emphasis here is that when he left earth, he was going to his Father. John 14:28, he said, because I said I go unto the Father, for my Father is greater than I. John 16 and verse 19, he says, when the Comforter comes, he'll reprove the world of sin and of righteousness and of judgment. Then he says, of righteousness, because I go to my Father. John 20 and verse 17, he said, but go to my Father and say unto them, I ascend unto my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. Hebrews 10 and verse 12 also states, but this man, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down on the right hand of God. Revelation also gives a vision of this when the woman clothed with the sun brought forth the man-child. The word said that he was caught up unto God and to his throne. There is no other place for him to go but to his Father, because he came from his Father and had no other place to go when he ascended. So when Christ entered once into the sanctuary to cleanse it with his own blood, he then left and went into the holiest in heaven to be with his Father. That cleansing took place in 31 AD, after 4,000 years of sacrificial offerings of animals. But for 2,000 years, those who come to Christ will benefit by his blood that would cleanse them. Not the blood of bulls and goats, but the blood of Christ himself. He had established. He said, this is my blood in the New Testament. When he instituted the communion service, he said, when you eat this bread and drink this blood, you are commemorating the fact that I have given you my blood to cleanse you from sin. And so Christ entered heaven and continues to minister on our behalf. So time and space intersect in the sanctuary. 4,000 years ended in 31 AD. And of course, if we were to put that in terms of millenniums, we can say this is the end of the fourth millennium in 31 AD. Remember, I mentioned to you that light was created on the fourth day. And what did the Bible say about Christ? It says, he was that light that has come into the world. And he came after fourth millennium. And so just as after the fourth day we had the sun and the moon and so forth created, so we know that after the fourth millennium, the sun of righteousness began to shine. And since we can be certain about the year of the atonement at the end of 4,000 years, then we can also be certain of the end of 6,000 years, or the end of the sixth millennium, which is certainly going to be 2,000 years later. So the sanctuary is a model. It is a model of the plan of redemption of 6,000 years, followed by the seventh millennium. The fourth 40 cubits representing 4,000 years, and the 20 cubits representing 2,000 years. The seventh millennium, of course, will be 1,000 years. Notice that the most holy place is just half of the holy. And notice the millennial cycle is just half of the most holy. So it was careful planning on the Father's part to get this into our minds, the Sabbath millennium, which would be the seventh millennium. And that, my friends, is just a few years away. So we have 6,000 years of work, and the 7,000 being that millennium when we will live and reign with Christ. Notice also the relationship of this prophecy of the 2,300 years beginning in 2270 BC and going all the way to the death of Christ on the cross, 2,300 years. That 4,000 years from Adam's sin to Christ's atonement then could be divided into two portions. The first portion being from Adam's sin to the Tower of Babel, or the founding of Babel, which is exactly 1,700 years, and then from the Tower of Babel to the establishment of Christ's kingdom is 2,300 years. So that adds up to 4,000 years. Then in 2,000 years after that, his schedule will bring us to the end of 6,000 years and the beginning of the 7th millennium. So we are now in the 5th sabbatical cycle of this final Jubilee. And after the 5th, of course, comes the 6th, and then after the 6th comes the 7th. Now, if Jerusalem was destroyed in the Jubilee year in 70 AD, can we speculate or imagine or even accept what will probably happen to the world in the world's final Jubilee cycle? Notice again in Jerusalem's final Jubilee, May 25th, the Romans breached the third wall. May 30th, the Romans entered the second quarter. July 22nd, another defense falls to Titus. By August 10th, the temple was destroyed by fire. September 26th, the whole thing was completed, and that was the end of that Jubilee year. Now let's look at how that relates to us today. Notice the last sabbatical cycle of the Jews' final Jubilee, and notice the years that of the Jewish years associated with it: 3823, 3824, 3825, 3826, 3827, 3828, 3829, and then the Jubilee year was 3830. Well, notice the final sabbatical cycle in the Gregorian calendar, that's pointing to the next Jubilee cycle for us in this generation. It's 2023, 2024, 2025, 2026, 2027, 2028, 2029, and 2030. Do you see any similarity in the Jewish calendar as compared to our calendar? Notice the 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, and 30. Friends, this is not any imagination. This is a divine plan that even though the calendars were distorted and shifted around, we see that there is still enough evidence to indicate to us that we are very close to the final sabbatical cycle of the 6th millennium, leading us up to the Jubilee year of 2030, and then the next year will be the beginning of the 7th millennium. There is no question about that. We understand that the divine insight cannot make errors. And we know from these figures and dates that everything fits perfectly. So just as when the Messiah came the first time, it was exactly on schedule. The 70th seven was from 2780 to 3480. 135 days was from the beginning of his ministry until the day of Pentecost when he was inaugurated. 1290 days were from the time that sacrifices and oblations ceased until the abomination of desolation set in, or until the 77th came to an end. Everything was so meticulously planned, and Christ knew that. He knew what day and year he had to die. He knew what day he would be inaugurated. And he had instructed the disciples to wait in Jerusalem for that day. Wait, he said, in Jerusalem for the gift of the Holy Spirit, because he had said in John 7:38 and 39 that the Holy Spirit was not yet given because he was not yet glorified. He knew exactly what the timing was, what the schedule was to be fulfilled right on schedule. We are faced with a similar schedule. Now, when he was asked, "When will you return?" he says, "No man knows the day or the hour." And so many people take this to mean that there should be no attempt to understand when his return is going to be. Friends, just imagine if he had told the disciples that he was not going to return till after 2013. What do you think they would have been doing for the first 20, 30 years of the gospel? They would have been waiting, or even be so discouraged that they will have no zeal or purpose for preaching, since his return was not going to be for another 2,000 years. And we know that it has been just about 1900 plus years since he returned, and he has not, since he went to heaven, but he has not yet returned to earth. And we are still saying, no man knows the day or the hour. But let me suggest to you that the day no man knows was always the first day of the 7th month. It was the day no man knows, because the only person that could call that day was the high priest. And the high priest calling that day was based on the moon. What position the moon was in. It had to be a new moon. It had to be a visible moon. And so he couldn't call it until the moon was visible. Well, then it was called the day no man knows, because only the high priest could call it. But it came every year. Every year there was a day that was called the day no man knows. So when Christ says no man knows that day, he was saying only the high priest going to call that day, but it could happen on a certain year. Now, what year could that possibly be? That, my friends, is what we understand from the Word, from the Scriptures. The Bible is the thing that will tell us exactly when this is going to happen. 2013 is in the 5th sabbatical cycle of the final Jubilee. The 7th seal with its 7 trumpets and 7 plagues will soon bring an end to the world as we know it and usher in the 7th millennium of Sabbath rest. Yes, friends, there are some unfulfilled 7s in the Bible. There are 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 plagues. The 7 seals ends with the 7 trumpets. The 7th seal is actually the 7 trumpets. And not only that, the 7th trumpet consists of 7 plagues. So if we look at it closer, look at the 7th seal, it consists of 7 trumpets. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. As a matter of fact, the fifth trumpet is actually the first woe. The 7th trumpet is the second woe, and the third woe is actually the 7th trumpet, which will be the 7 last plagues. So the third woe is the 7th trumpet and also the 7 last plagues. And then, of course, we see the 7 last plagues, which are poured out without mixture on this earth. Earth's final Jubilee cycle of 7 sabbatical years. Notice, again, 1986, 1993, 2000, 2007, 2014, 2021, and 2028 begins the 7th sabbatical cycle, and 2029 is the last Sabbath year before the 7th millennium begins. So you better believe it, like the hands on a clock, the sabbatical cycle, the Jubilee cycle, and the millennial cycle all converge in 3 consecutive years. The Sabbath year of 2029, the Jubilee year of 2030, and the millennial year of 2031. This will be happening in the very near future, and it's the first time in the world's history that you will have a Sabbath year, a Jubilee year, and a millennial year coming back to back as we see here. So, what is the certainty that we have? We know with certainty that the 7th millennium will begin in 2031. We also know that destruction will occur during the Jubilee year, which is 2030, just as it was executed in the Jubilee year of 70 AD. So we can say then that the 7 last plagues will most likely be upon us in the Jubilee year of 2030. What we do not know is the exact day and hour of his coming in one of these years. No man knows that day or that hour, but certainly we have enough information to let us know that it will happen before the 7th millennium begins, because we will spend 1,000 years with him. So it's really, folks, about time. It's about time, as the scriptures outline it, but it's also about time for us to be ready, accept him, and also his Sabbaths too. So now is the time, and that knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep, for now is our salvation nearer than when we first believed. Romans 13 and verse 11. Now is the time to buy of me, he says in Revelation 3:18. Buy of me gold tried in the fire, that thou mayest be rich, and white raiment, that thou mayest be clothed, and that the shame of thy nakedness do not appear, and anoint thine eyes with eye salve, that thou mayest see. This, of course, is the message to Laodicea, that thinks that she is rich and increased in goods and have the need of nothing, but she doesn't know that she is poor, naked, and wretched and blind. Now is the time to come out of her, my people, Babylon, the false churches. Now is the time to come out of unbelief. Now is the time to come out of falsehood, false doctrines, false prophecies. Stop following false prophets. Now is the time that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues, for her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities. And he says in Revelation 22 and verse 12, And behold, I am coming quickly, and my reward is with me, to give to every one according to his work.